Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to have Warren Rush here in our class and presenting as part of the Sustainability Speaker Series here at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies today. And I am going to read Warren's biography just so we lay that foundation, and we're going to hear a good bit from Warren about how this relates to his work. So Warren is a global resilience design consultant, educator, lecturer, and storyteller. He has worked for over 25 years in regenerative systems design for communities, private and public organizations, households, smallholder farms, and conservation properties worldwide. He is co-founder of Quail Springs Permaculture, Regenerative Earth Enterprises, Sustainable Vocations, Wilderness Youth Project, Casitas Valley Farm and Creamery, and his permaculture design company, True Nature Design. He is also an advising founder of the Permaculture Research Institute of Kenya. He is a part of the USAID's TOPS, which stands for Technical Operations Performance Support Program, where he trains technical field staff for their African Food for Peace programs in a resilience design framework. He works extensively in North America, Africa, Middle East, Europe, and Australia. He has taught the following courses: Permaculture Design Certification, Earthworks for Resiliency, Resilient Smallholder Farm Design, Permaculture for International Development, Rainwater Harvesting Systems, Ferrocement Tank Building, Community Design using Permaculture, Permaculture Investing, Spring Rejuvenation and Watershed Restoration, Compost Toilet Systems, Water for Every Farm, Drought-Proofing Landscapes, and Ecological Restoration. And that just gives you a sense of what Warren's doing for the world today. So thank you, Warren, for being here today.
Yeah, lovely. I appreciate it.
Had a bit of a drive, and we appreciate
it was all good. I was just up. Thank you. I was just up at the Permaculture National Convergence up in Hopland at the Solar Living Institute. I did the keynote for that, and so I was able to come back around and come over here and stop off and visit my mom. So that was great. Yeah. So I want to first start with gratitude, just to thank everybody who keeps the Middlebury Institute moving with such good dialogue and such good academic rigor. And we're living in a time when we're really needing to not just think outside the box, but think as if there is no box, and really understand that innovation, we are in a time of innovation, I believe, if we're going to survive as a species. And so I start to think of innovation. What is innovation? And if you look at the root of innovation, it's innovatium, which is it's restoration, renewal, and change. And I think about the work that I've been doing, I think about a lot of the work that's generated out of Middlebury Institute, that it is about restoration, renewal, and change. And how do we go about restoring landscapes, but in a way that's never been seen before? We're in a place where we can't go back. We have to actually walk forward in the healing process on the ground. And I think about innovation is, if you think of systems theory, all new energy enters from the edge. So if you think of a system, if you want to bring new energy into a system, you go to the edge of the system to translate energy. So as we're doing and designing agroecosystems around the world, we're constantly using what we call an edge dynamic. And I think the work that's actually going on here is about creating people who move to the edge to translate new energy into systems and into policy sets that need change for a rapidly, changing world. And so I think you're sitting at the edge with what you're learning, and I'm really grateful to all the people who are bringing this about. And I'm grateful for each of you for stepping into an area of study that is potentially, you have such an impact through policy development, through the work of internationally linking organizations, linking movements together through policy, and through being able to, I didn't catch your name, but Kate. Kate was sharing about how, I think you were saying, like, the humanitarian and the environmental aspects of a lot of organizations and academic institutions, they don't talk, they don't relate. And what we're finding is that resilience is about relationships. In fact, resilience is dependent on relationships. So if you have, like, for example, a lot of times in USAID, we're working with an organization that has, they'll have a program in a region that has you know, a whole department for nutrition, a whole department for environmental work, a whole department for agriculture, a whole department for economic development, and they never talk. And so a lot of our work in building resilience is about getting those conversations going. It's the same way biologically. If you have an element in your system in isolation, it's not very resilient. How many other relationships can that element have? So if you have maize growing, and it's growing out there all alone, it's not very resilient because it doesn't have a supporting guild. So biologically, it needs to also have a relationship with water and soil that could be developed through just small earthworks that are developed on the ground. They need a relationship with other plants that draw in different types of pollinators to be resilient. So looking at what other layers can you add into that system. And we're doing systems now of maize that have over 12 species of production plants growing within a maize plot. And we're finding that there's less pest damage, there's more resilience to climate extremes, because now you have a guild of plants working together to be able to support the maize and support the other living parts of the system. So it's true within our environment as well as in the biological environment, which tells me that we're a part of nature. Because you can find a lot of the natural patterns that happen in the world are also working itself through our world. And molecularly, it was really funny discussion about, you know, one satirical way of looking at population reduction would be to eat the babies. But if you think about it, it's like, you know, I don't advocate that. I want to put that out there. I'm not saying that. It was just an interesting discussion, because if you look at it molecularly, we are made up of the same nutritive components of our soils. And so in a way, it's like we have to also think of, when we do die, do we go back into the nutrient cycle? Are we actually being put back in a way where we get uptaken into that nutrient cycle?
We're actually toxic waste when we die.
If you run through certain fungi and you run through a decomposition process, a lot of the heavy metals and a lot of the antibiotics that go into our body actually get bound in long-chain carbon molecules and become inert to plant uptake. So there's a real interesting look at it, but it's a really good thought to think of too. Then what are you building in your body if it can't be uptaken into the next layer of life-giving production? So it's an interesting thought. So just wanted to start with gratitude, and just to be thankful for the work that's going on around the world, and that there is no single answer, I believe. There's no one policy, there's no one belief set, there's no one religion, there's no one crop, there's no one modified genetic anything that's going to be the single answer. I really feel that, that we need to approach things from a place of diversity. The Tutu Hill Mayan, which are the Highland Mayan people, they have this word which is their Armageddon. It's like the end of the world in the most negative way. And if you translate it into English, it's oneness, which is kind of this interesting thing, which they say that when all the world loses its diversity, it'll be the end of the world. That it has to have diversity. It can't be homogenized. And we are starting to understand that from a biological standpoint, that biodiversity directly relates to life production and the continuance of life production. So it's a really important thing to think of as we start to develop policies that are out there. Are we honoring the multitude of solutions? Can we link them together rather than to try to hold on to one or use that binary way of thinking, it's good, bad? You guys were talking about this earlier today, about Kate was saying about, you know, there's the, like, you can have, there's this kind of way we're raised to, there's good and bad, so you always think in everything is binary. And more now we're watching televisions and screens which are binary flashes, so we're starting to pattern on binary solutions as well. It's either good or bad. But what we're finding is in nature, there's no one way or another way. It's always a multitude of interconnectedness that actually helps a system to thrive.
If we're seeing things in black and white, we're not using our gray matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And the world's just not as colorful, is it? I love that. It's like each one of us here, I believe, has a gift that has never been before expressed in the history of humanity. And never in the future of all humanity, the gifts you carry will be expressed. I feel that your diverse thing that you have to offer the world is unique to the history of humanity. And so it's up for us to not try to homogenize that into a thing that everybody can feel comfortable with, but it's actually, when you have a cultural basket, you're lifting everybody up into their uniqueness and their diversity. Just as it happens in nature. Everybody fills their niche, which is a biological concept, an ecological concept, is the filling of the niche. And so finding what that is for you is just like a healthy forest, finding all the niches that are needed to have a healthy ecosystem. You'll find I constantly refer back to biology, and I constantly refer back to ecological dynamics because I feel there's a lot of solutions for us in natural processes, politically, culturally, and they link directly together. So I want to see if I can get this to move. Oh, there he is. So I want to start with a story. When I do a lot of work in Africa, I feel so fortunate because I also feel like I do some of my greatest learning in Africa, and I bring it back and apply it to where I live. I don't believe in aid, I only believe in exchange. And so when I'm going into different places, I'm always learning more than I could possibly bring. I really, truly, I mean that, and I believe that. So I was flying into an area, a place called Kisumu, which is in eastern Kenya, western Kenya. And there was some workers who were coming in there was a Peace Corps worker, and then there were some folks from one of the very large NGOs that was USAID funded. And it was my first time into that region of Kenya. And we happened to be sitting next to each other on the plane, and I'm like, well, what are you coming over here for? And they said, oh, well, we're in a poverty reduction program that is helping these poor people in Rongo, which are only making $1 a day, and they're some of the poorest people in Africa, they're some of the poorest people in Kenya, and we're here to really help them so they can make more of an economy. They can actually have more money. I mean, can you imagine, one of them said, living on $1 a day? Well, I didn't say anything. I got there, and I started to go out through the region. I was asked to go out and to work with a farmer co-op there that was trying to actually enter some of their products into the organic market, so helping them to shift that, and to work with, I'm a soil specialist as well, so I do a lot of work with soil biology. So I was doing some training and different things there. I went around through this region where people are only making $1 a day, and there was still a cultural basket intact with that landscape and the people. There was an elder culture that existed, that you still had people in all the stratas of age and experience living together in communities. You still had ancient, intact communication methods still working in the villages. You still had a lot of initiations going on at that point. They had a very diverse diet. The average farm I was finding had over 40 species of food plants growing. So a huge amount of nutritional diversity going on. You had a stable ecosystem on the farm, so what we call it is an agro-ecosystem was very, very stable. The hydrological cycle was intact. I had a very hard time in these systems finding any erosion. You had a natural slowing, spreading, and sinking of the water as that kinetic energy of the rain is falling. If it doesn't get slowed, spread, and sunk by different plant life and organic matter, then it becomes a real challenge on the landscape, because that kinetic energy then strikes the soils, breaks up the soils, binds it up, and flows away. And what do we call that? Yeah, we call that erosion. So you start seeing erosion when you don't have this slow spread and sink pattern going on with your agro-ecosystem. So they had this. The wells that were intact were always full. Always full there. Then you had people on average, a family had on average 2 hectares of land. And they were growing all their food. They had what we call, what I have deemed to call mutual interdependence, where there was actual mutual need within the community was still intact. They hadn't basically turned away for everything that they need from an outside source. So what they found was that there were specialists in the community based on their gifts that would then help them meet their needs. So there was this intact mutual interdependence and there was no debt. Yet, how much were they making? They didn't know that they were poor. That's what the world had said they're poor. They were wealthy based on their view of what their wealth is. Now that is different everywhere. I was just sitting with a community of Paiute Indians in Bishop. I was doing a course out there last weekend, and the weekend before last. And it was this indigenous community living on a reservation, and we mapped out what is wealth for them. Before I ever start working from a community, I want to know what they value, not give my valuation of what they should want. And it's different everywhere we go. If we did it here, it would be different than if you went home and did it with your family. And then we start to look and say, oh, well, that dollar, you know, why does this have value? You know, this thing. What gives it more value than this? I mean, maybe this is really valuable. I didn't even really look. But this is bigger, right? You have more paper. Usually more is better. What gives this possibly more value?
Fed.
Well, it's not fed because you're not interacting with the Fed every day. So what have you done to give it value?
We gave it the value.
Based on what?
Some norms that we set. We decided that it has to be the way of measuring wealth or how you buy things or whatever.
An agreement.
An agreement.
Yeah, we make an agreement that this has a certain amount of life energy based attached to it. It can buy a certain amount of energy, basically. If you look at caloric energy of some form or another. And this doesn't have that agreement. But if the agreement changes, like it did in Zimbabwe a few years ago, where I had some of my colleagues there say they were standing in line at the store with their groceries, and by the time they got to the checkout counter, the cost of it had gone up. Inflation was moving so quickly to the point where now their dollar is no longer used at all. So if that's lost, this may have more value, because what could you use this for if there's no agreement?
Taking notes.
Yeah, you could take notes on it. It's pretty.
Toilet paper.
Yeah, you could do a little of this. You could mulch with it. You could light a fire with it. This would probably be more valuable in that area. So it's this interesting thing when we start to value wealth and you put money as a big one. What I find is then what is the energy of that buy? And we start to map that out, because in itself, pieces of paper don't necessarily mean wealth, do they? It's the agreement that means wealth and what it's actually getting you. So what we do is we map out what are the things you would buy with this, and to see if there's other pathways. Is the only pathway this, you're vulnerable and not resilient. And that's a really big thing that I run into in the humanitarian world. Is that they say, oh, if they make $10 a day, they will be resilient, and they check off their resilient box. And then, like in Zimbabwe, the money's gone. And all of a sudden, people have sold out their multiple forms of natural capital for something like this. And so what happened in Rongo was a really interesting thing. You had the development of sugarcane imposed upon the region. And basically, from what I could track from people I knew, is that it was forced through people, politicians being bought out, and basically a land grab started to happen in that region. And they started to force people to grow sugarcane in that region. And what you started to find very quickly after moving from a very stable, both culturally and ecologically based agro-ecosystem, we started to see moving to a monocrop, a simplification of the system started to bring massive erosion, we started to see the loss of your basic bank account, which is soil. All economies are dependent on healthy ecologies, and all healthy ecologies are dependent on healthy soils. I really believe that, and there's a lot of evidence to show that, if you look at it, really deeply. Because just energy for a human to work within an economic system takes a healthy ecology. You can have a really good economy moving and no water, and you have to abandon it. And I've seen that recently as well, which is just crazy. We saw hydrological collapse in the area. We saw an incredible rise in debt dependence. So to move to a monocrop system that is now unnaturally being grown in the landscape, because nature never grows a monocrop. You always have yields. So that tells you, if you push against nature, what does it cost you? What does it cost you? If you're rolling a rock uphill or downhill, what's it going to cost you if you roll it uphill? It's a form of energy. Yeah, it's a form of energy. You're pushing up against a natural force of gravity. So that's true in all forms of natural processes. So we find if you want to lower your expenses, harmonize more with natural processes. It doesn't cost as much. And so here in a monocrop system, it costs a lot of energy, and so you have to then find other forms of energy to be able to input in the system rather than harmonizing with what nature's doing. So a lot of the agroforestry movement, the food forestry movement, is all about harmonizing with natural patterns. Yeah. And so here we started to see an ecological collapse coupled with malnutrition as their income rose. And it's just a really interesting study of this area. It also happened in Kitui district of Kenya. And you saw an increased dependency on things they had no relationship with. So they started to, I always say, suckle from the global nipple, so to speak, rather than being in relationship with all the things that sustained them in the past. We're in that same place. I always share that with people, that we're in a vulnerable place because we're not in relationship with that which sustains us. So I'm not just talking about Africans doing this. This is coming back to here. And so I do the same work here that I do there. And both of them I learn from, definitely. And then ultimately, you can watch erosion in the landscape, and you can almost map out erosion culturally with the erosion in the landscape. I almost get the chills saying that because they're completely dependent on each other. And so when you start to see a landscape that no longer has an intactness in it ecologically, you find that there's no longer an intact cultural root there. So, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We could spend weeks talking about that. I mean, right down to language being one of the big ones. How to live on the land is embedded in your language. You know, a lot of different things like that. So then what starts to happen? You get downstream consequences. You get increased turbidity in your streams, basically sediment transport. You get deposition where there was no longer, or not natural deposition was happening, so you start to see the silting in of rivers, great rivers and streams. So now the hydrology starts to shift. You see dead zones in the water sinks. So I know a lot of study is done here as well about effects in the oceans, and you see these great dead zones coming out that are a part of this problem of downstream consequence of poor agriculture practices. Then you see chemical and organic pollution, you see increased disease that follows it. And in addition to that, you also see carbon. Oh, please.
Sorry, comment. Yesterday in econ class, we were talking about using either a cap and trade or a tax to work with a small African nation that's dealing with nitrate poisoning. And the discussion that we had in our group was that if we apply either of those mechanisms, it's just putting off the disaster. It's like lengthening the time.
Yeah.
It's not solving the problem again. And what we said is if we are going to use cap and trade or a tax or whatever, we need to have that to be a transition period back to a healthier way. Not just continue that because it accumulates and all of these situations continue and just get worse over time.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So here it is now, we have a simplified complex, we've simplified a complex polycultural into a very simplified monocrop-based system and a singular crop across an entire region. So you started to see pest infestations that would come in to be a part of nature's reparation process. So there's a process called succession, which is how if you cut everything down, scrape a piece of land, and you just watch what happens, there'll be all these layering of different types of plants and different patterns in insects that will happen as a part of the reparation to bring it back to a climax polyculture. And so you start to see that this whole area starts to become more chemically dependent because now there's more of this succession process trying to bring it back. And you have less diversity of pollinators, you know, and it starts being a cascading effect of degradation. You start to see also the release of stable carbon sinks. I'll talk about that in a minute, and the loss of organic matter. It literally gets transported away, and you start to lose that ability for living what I call carbon pathways gets diminished. So our ability to actually create fast-growing carbon pathways is very diminished. And what we're finding is, in a lot of the most recent research, is if you have the forest clearing and, you know, basically the clearing of a complex polyculture for a conventional agriculture, simplified agriculture system, it will account for the largest source of man-made gases, the release of carbon into the atmosphere. Consequently, though, you know, you have the increase occurred mainly in developing countries due to an expansion. So this whole, one of the things we're seeing, the fastest kind of release of carbon dioxide is happening in developing countries that are removing their polycultures and removing native forests and coupling it with a simplified system that tills the land and releases the stored carbon in the soils. But in permaculture and just in sensible ways of living is we have to look at how do we turn the problem into the solution. So knowing that the soil is one of the most important carbon sinks available that we can have the most effect on, what we realize, and Dr. Ratan Lal from Ohio State, he talks about a mere 2% increase in carbon content in the planet's soils could offset 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere. Which tells us that this is and a lot of other studies that are out there talking about how we could bring back the carbon levels in the atmosphere to pre-industrial times very quickly with just a 2% rise in organic matter, basically is what they're saying, in our arable soils currently being used for agriculture. And then you start to look at that and you see that 1/3 of the world's population today still are smallholder farmers. Yeah. And that smallholder farmers produce still to this day, and this is constantly co-opted by big industry saying that smallholder farmers can't feed the world, only big industry can. And to this day, 70% of all food consumed and on 60% of the arable land is being done by smallholder farmers. And that's IFAD did this study, and there's a bunch of other studies around it. And the average smallholder farm, they're saying, is about 2 hectares or 5 acres. So here it is, you have 1/3 of the world's population, 60% of the land, and we know how to do this. We know how to design to put this back in, and very quick we can create these fast carbon pathways. So a lot of our focus, because there's less politics involved than big industry, has been to focus through USAID on smallholder farmers. Let me show.
Does USAID support this then?
Yes.
I mean, is this their trend of change that's happening, or what?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting dialogue because I also have been horrified by what they've been doing around the world. So.
Yeah.
But we have this really weird wedge in their door that we're able to, we're very quickly, I'll explain that in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great,
so
great.
This is a story of a place that led before USA got involved, but this is in a place which was a watershed leading to Lake Victoria, which is where Rongo's watershed was leading to. And all that destruction was happening. And here, if you look, This was a very stable ecology about 30 years ago. This was completely covered in forest. And here in the landscape, where you see the landscape goes from convex to concave, they used to always have springs flowing from there down to the village, fresh water, from the water infiltrating from the forest that was up on the hill. Now, being on the edge of Lake Victoria, they said, the old-timers said, that there was a cloud that never left here. It was always there. Just like the Hawaiian Islands, you have the water clouds that would be there. And there's a national park you can see from the top of here where they restored the trees and the cloud came back. And so this was a place where it was a hydrological pump that was feeding fresh water down to the village. So then you had the war in northern Uganda, and you had refugees brought into this area, and there was a lot of politics. This particular island was a place that was opposing the current government, so they sent all the refugees there to give population pressure. It was a form of political warfare for this island. And so the pressures there were so strong, and basically they divvied up the highlands from being community land into being individual land. And within about 5 years, the entire island was deforested. And then you started to see the collapse of the hydrological system, and now people didn't have fresh water coming to them, flowing to you, clean and fresh. They now had to go downhill to the lake. And as soon as they started to go to the lake, well, one, you have to carry water uphill, which cost a lot of energy. So their cultural dynamics started to change really quickly just to get water to the village. And then you also had then cholera come in because of all the effluent that came down. And then erosion start to happen. So we got there, and I've seen this all over. And we did basically work with local farmers to rebuild the sponge. That's a terminology I like to use, is rebuild the sponge so that there's a receiving landscape for water. And that we were able to slow spread and sink the water like nature did, but we had to give it a jump start. So we started by teaching them about how to work with different types of water harvesting structures that they could do with simple tools that they make themselves, which is always very, very important, not to get them even dependent on a tool that they can't maintain or keep that for the healing process that they can't do themselves. How accessible is it? Even the survey equipment was built from local wood. Like, we made our A-frames right from there rather than bringing in a laser, you know, it's not something they could fix or even get batteries for. And then how to work together to better the hydrology of the region so that each farmer was more successful. So that there became an ethic of hydrological stewardship. Because wherever water flows, so does nutrient. And life is dependent on it. But fast-moving water is fast-moving water, you have less biodiversity. That's a natural principle. High up in the mountains, you have much less biodiversity than low down when the water's moving really slow, where you have an incredible amount of biodiversity. So we know that by slowing water down, we can increase biodiversity. There's better uptake into plant life by slower moving water. So we're constantly looking at how can we move this now unnatural, erosive water channels that are going on and respread them through the landscape and get them into fast carbon pathways of building up the agro-ecosystem. And so look at this site right here where we're doing this. This is the same site 3 years later, where we've now built a very stable agro-ecosystem where in a lot of dry land areas like this, you need shade for better production in your plants, which is totally counter to what a lot is being taught to people around the world. It's like, oh, clear everything. You don't need to have direct sunshine. We have or you need to have full sunshine to get growing, which is a temperate mentality from the north. When you get into a dry land, we find that we can actually increase production with having 60 to 70% shade in the dry land environment and equatorial environment. And we can find that in areas where there's a lot of rainfall and you don't have a lot of sun exposure during the rainy season, that we can coppice the plants and use them for mulches. But here the difference to me is that we're not just starting by putting in fruit trees and planting a crop. We're actually building a perennial system of fertility and rainwater harvesting, and basically nutrient to continue to feed the soil so we don't have to buy nutrient from offsite. And once this got into everybody's head, it was amazing to see. We had 26 farmers jump on the bandwagon right away saying, we're going to do this. And we've been going back and supporting them. It's pretty amazing, this area, and how it's transforming now. And now they have the tools for it. They're training other farmers. I always share this too. I do this at home as well. This is my home farm, which is down. Any of you ever been to Carpinteria, California? Or ever heard of it? Yeah, it's down south of Santa Barbara. And this is our farm, and we do the exact same things there. We do water harvesting structures, we do polycultures. We have over 80 species of food production going on and animal integration. And so I always share this, that when I go out in the world, when I'm asking somebody to do compost toilets, I also share that that's what I do at home. And I have that experience for myself. And I find that that's really important in international work. What are you carrying out there? Are you doing something at home that's completely counter, ethically even, to what you're promoting? And I find that when you go into a village and they see that, they'll ask you, they'll look at your hands, and they'll say, okay, well, I see some calluses, and I see, you know, they'll like look at your shoes. Are they scuffed up? They'll look, you know, there's all these things. And I actually carry little books of the 2 farms that our family has. And I show people where I live in a mud house. I live in a mud house. I have compost toilets. I have milk goats. We grow all our food. And people are like, oh my God, I never hear that from people from the West, you know. And I find that there's a different kind of relationship that develops when you can actually be out there milking a goat with them authentically, or you know how to butcher, or you know how to do this, and you're going out and speaking to people. I know that's not everybody's path, but that thinking of it from any level in which you go into the world, how are you doing that work at home? And that's a big message I'd like to bring to people who are working around the world, is what are you then doing at home? Are you congruent with that? So USAID, it's interesting, there started to be a lot of data coming in from failed programs all over their Food for Peace programs, failure after failure after failure, and one statistic really blew them away, because basically they found that in areas where everybody was getting their carbohydrates, their proteins, they were getting all the things grown from these monocrop systems, and then they were basically nutrient deficient in the populations, and they started to see stunting. And so the whole TOPS program, which is the Technical Operations Performance Support Unit, developed because of stunting. It's kind of an interesting thing, that our charge is to reverse stunting. And what it came back to is that it was unhealthy soils had poor nutrient uptake. And so then it went to, well, what makes healthy soils? And you just can't do it with a monocrop. You cannot build with heavy tillage, compaction, monocrop systems a healthy soil biota, which is what translates micronutrients, which is what leads to better nutrition. And so they were like, oh my God, that's everything we're promoting is causing this. And so they put some, basically some benchmarks in their system to try to move it towards being healthy. And so they got a hold of people who were out on the edge of their systems. And just to show this picture here, this is a typical field that's eroding away. I don't know if you can see the erosion. This is 4 years of drought in Zimbabwe. This is one farmer's first crop. This is their only crop that year. And this is another farmer just right up the road, who, not in a wet area, but was an area that had erosion like this one, but they then used resilience design principles to actually redesign the site. And this is his second crop in the same year. So even in a drought year, we were seeing farmers using resilience design principles we're getting 2 crops even in a dry year. Which people, and it's just farm after farm. Like we visited about 50 farms that had this kind of resilience going on to it. And they already know how to do it. It's already there. It's like it's happening. But there's still a lot of promotion of things like this, which is basically saying they're exporting their crop. If you have a large monocrop, it means export, generally. And you know, some would be for nutrition and then some would be for sale. Because even in America, most farmers couldn't feed themselves, even if they have 10,000 acres in production, because it's all one crop. You'd be malnutrition. You'd have malnutrition. So we were asked to give a presentation of people who were not involved in USAID, and all these different edge dwellers were brought in. I don't know if any of you have heard of Steve Gleesman. I consider him the grandfather of agroecology, and he's a good friend, and he actually lives in the valley where we have our dryland farm, retired there. And there was a bunch of us that went there and did this presentation, and they were just blown away by some of the results that we were getting at different sites around the world, like the ones I was showing you. And that led to us developing, working with them with their Food for Peace programs and all the organizations that they're funding to start to look at how would we bring in this idea of resilience design? How would we bring it into the people that are there? And using the TOPS program as the vehicle for it, because it's a program that was structured to be able to go and give to be able to support different programs. It's in its very name. You know, it's a technical support group. And so we developed both the permagarden program, because that's where you can get the most effect in helping someone to get through their nutritional needs so that then they could grow the farm. Because imagine trying to do a farm and not having nutrition. I mean, it is hard to work 5 acres. I don't know if any of you have ever done that. It is a lot of work. And so you need nutrition first. So we started with the permagarden program, which is a program of working with developing, using biointensive methods, really good water harvesting structures, protection structures, and to be able to get a lot of food growing in a very small space. And then moved those same principles of design to the larger farm. And we're just in the midst right now of developing all the toolkits for it. And we've been running trainings in Zimbabwe and Malawi. We're doing it in Uganda. We're going to be in November. Then we have another training in Nepal in January. And then we're doing another training in Ethiopia in March. So it's like we're just doing these trainings, and now the toolkit's coming out. And so I'll stay in touch with you as it comes out. If you're interested and want to see the Resilience Design Toolkit, we can link it to it and you can get a PDF of it. And it's quite a tome. So I'm not going to, I just have a few minutes left. I can't believe how quick 50 minutes goes. And I need to stop in 5?
No, you can go a little bit longer, and we have, you know, until 11:30 basically for discussion.
Okay, good. I'll take a few more minutes then. So what is this process? And so I'm not going to go into it, but it's other than just give you a real brief snapshot of resilience design, it's a tool for designing human settlement in an integrated way, in a regenerative way. It's a tool set for design. And it starts with ethics and principles. So it's an ethical design science, basically. And a lot of universities that have picked up permaculture around the world are calling permaculture the science that links all the sciences. The linking science. And I love that, because we started off with that conversation about relationships and how the relationship of resilience and having good, strong resilience is directly related to the amount of relationships, beneficial relationships between elements in a system. And so how do we do that design? What are the processes? And these were all derived, all of these principles, from indigenous agriculture practices of people that have been sustainable on the landscape for over 1,000 years. And then it was combined with sound science. So here's the sound science with appropriate technology. So it's this kind of combination of indigenous innovation, indigenous understanding, sound science and ecological process, and our understanding of ecological processes through science, and then appropriate technology. And so you can see there's a whole lot to it. I'm not going to go into each one of these. It would take a whole lot of time. But then we bring that, like when you look at a site on the ground, we start to look through this different lenses of these principles, and we start to put it into the methodology. So we basically have a whole set of things that we do. So we start by community engagement is the starting point. So before we ever go in and somebody says, oh, I want to design a farm. I'll be in Iran in November or December. And they're like, oh, we just want you to come in and design a farm. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. You know, you could come in and design something. It doesn't mean it'll be relevant. It might be ecologically sound, it might be productive, but it may not be relevant to the people there. So I always start in this place of community engagement. And there's a lot of tools that we're developing within this. There's a lot of tools that are already out there, participatory methods that make a lot of sense about engaging, like the wealth issue. How could you design a farm if you don't understand what's wealthy to them? And so if you're going to be there in support, and then also for me, I want them to know how to design the next farm. So I won't design a farm unless they know how to do the next one. So there's got to be a built-in strategy for training and upcycling the information through their local understandings and their local innovations. Part of the community engagement process is seeking out local innovation. Finding who's the innovators and bringing them up to teach with you. So you're doing it together with local innovators. Sometimes people don't even realize somebody's doing an innovation. But they're doing it because it made sense, and they don't see it as an innovation. And all of a sudden you have someone coming out of the West saying, wow, this is something I can do at home. And it all of a sudden puts the whole level of learning at a whole different place, because then it starts to be an exchange. There's much more to it than that. We then start to gather data, and there's a whole process. We do resource mapping, participatory resource mapping. We start to look at what's happening in the area, what's the historical context. Hearing in that one place that was the watershed leading to Lake Victoria, their whole story of their history there was very important for them to understand why we need to bring back the systems that slow, spread, and sink water had to do with what was there before and their historical understanding of that. We found that only trees that weren't cut were the trees that were buried over powerful medicine people. They had a certain tree they would put over these, they called them ancestor trees. So those trees were the only ones there. And we could actually go and look what was happening to the soils under those trees. And they were amazed, because that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to mimic that. And then we went back out and did it in the landscape. So it was always this process of gathering data. And then going into an observation process. Every site, looking at every site. Assessing what's happening, what's the slope, where's the sun angles, all these different things, starting to see where is there more water, where is there less water. Well, funny enough, a lot of policies within USA don't allow you to do site-specific work. They have certain strategies you apply ubiquitously just to everyone. And that just every farm needs this, you check it off a box. And it just doesn't make sense. Not every strategy works for every landscape. And so we started to really look at how that is an important part of site-specific design. Even like this building as opposed to the building across there is going to have different influences on it. From the sun, the wind, the traffic, how it's oriented. You know, there's just a lot of different things that will happen just from two buildings, two different sites. We'll have different criteria to actually get it to be designed well with that landscape. And then we do what's called element analysis, which is basically looking at all the things that we put on the site, whether it's a chicken or a human or a plant or a biogas digester or whatever it might be, and we start to analyze those things for their intrinsic characteristics. What does it take? What's the inputs that it needs? What's the outputs? Like with any element in a system, like a chicken, if you understand where they evolved in response to what type of environment, you can then mimic that environment, and you have less stress, you don't need antibiotics, you have better production, they have better conversion rates of their food to meat, muscle, eggs, all of that. So then you have to start to learn the natural pattern of that element, and that's an analysis of it. Well, where do chickens come from? Just out of curiosity, anybody know? Where did chickens evolve from?
In the jungle.
What jungle? That's great. So jungle, that's huge, just to know that. But where? Which came first? No, I'm just kidding. The egg or the chicken? The dinosaur. So they evolved in the Southeast Asian jungles. So understanding that about a chicken, if you put them in a scenario where they're in full sun all the time, you're going to see stress. Now stress costs what? Energy. I mean, we're just designing for energy here, folks. That's all we're doing. And you start to see when an animal has stress, whether it's human, whether it's a cow, whether it's a goat or a chicken, it's going to cost energy, and that energy then needs to be supplemented to help it maintain itself. Well, interestingly enough, if you have a scenario that they're in a natural environment and they don't have a lot of stress, the energy inputs go down, their production goes up. And that's just a rule of thumb. Just a rule of thumb. It may take longer for the meat to develop than if you're pumping them full of corn, because what do chickens eat in a forest? Do they eat corn? No. Not in Southeast Asia, because where did corn come from?
South America.
Central America, yeah. Central America. Spread out. So no, it wasn't that. What's their primary food source?
Maybe insects and stuff from the sun.
That's it, right there. So you see there's French recipes that call for eggs from chickens who are only eating insects. Because I don't know if you've ever seen a really fresh egg that's, you crack it open and they've been eating insects and it's really orange, the yolk, and you swish it around and it doesn't go bleh, it just it's really great. I mean, it's amazing, and the taste is so different. And you start to see then that translates to better health for those who eat the eggs. So you start to see a relationship with the nutritional value with the patterns the animal is being exposed to. So if that animal is not getting its full nutritional, it's basically being pumped up with, antibiotics, with hormones, a lot of hormones to help them navigate being in an unnatural situation, an unnatural diet, they're fattened up. They may look very good, they may be thick and juicy, but you'll see the nutrient content is always diminished. One of the things I've been doing as part of my work around the world is I carry a refractometer. Anybody know what that is? A refractometer?
Does it measure the amount of light that's refracted and what colors on the spectrum are refracted?
But what you can do is you can calibrate it to proteins, you can calibrate it to sugars or micronutrients. So it's what viticulture, grape growers, winemakers use, is they take the refractometer and they see what's the sugar content. But that is a spectrum of micronutrients. So if you have a high sugar content and you have, like in an apple, it always tastes better. And you see that it actually has more micronutrients in it if you have a higher, what they call Brix level. And so that there's just a better taste to it. Or a tomato, like you get a conventional grown Vaughn's or Safeway tomato and you put it next to a tomato grown on our farm with really good soils. And you taste it, like my little granddaughter, she'll taste it, and she'll just spit out the one. She literally spits it out. She's like, that looks like a tomato. She's 2, but it's not a tomato because it doesn't taste like a tomato. But then she'll eat the one that she loves, and it's sweet, and it's just tastes different. Well, that's measurable. And what we're starting to find is that's a really good tool to see the health of the soil biology. Because the more your healthy soil ecology is happening in your growing systems, the better nutrient uptake happens, the better the food taste, and the higher the nutrients. So all of a sudden now, when I'm traveling around, I'm pulling the nutritionist from one set of an organization with the agriculturist, and we're walking together and saying, let's look at what's happening here. And it's actually, the relationship came through this really interesting little tool. And they're like, oh my gosh, it's so interesting to see that. And so we're finding simple tools like that to say, wow, yeah, you can grow food, but it doesn't mean there's nutrition in it.
Can you taste the difference between GMO food?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, one, I avoid it like the plague. I try not to have genetically modified. I try to be in relationship with all the food that I'm eating other than when I travel. So when I'm traveling, it's a little harder. I try to, I try to eat more locavore stuff, but it's...
I just wonder if they can mimic
yeah.
that.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is it still goes back to the soil. Even that, they're not increasing nutrient uptake with GMO. They're creating kind of artificial barriers for the succession process to take it out. And so yeah, and they're finding that there was a big breakthrough a few days ago about a bacteria that exists in soil that actually helps plants to ward off, like corn, to ward off the corn borer. And they found that now there's a whole thing with corn. Even the resistant varieties, the GMO, are now getting corn borers now because it's molting. So it's evolving. The conditions are evolving that corn borers are getting resistant to the resistant strains of maize. But they found now this bacteria in soil, and I'm like, well, that's why you build a healthy soil biota with that bacteria in it. That's the place where there was a microbiologist on NPR yesterday as I was driving here, and he was just talking about this, like we are so susceptible in the West because of how we're ultra cleaning everything to not actually have a healthy biota in and around our systems that actually keep us healthy. We've actually gone so far the other way. And so he just wrote a book called Why We Should Eat Dirt. And it's him and a very famous microbiologist. I forget his name, but the way they were talking about him. So then we do basically a sector analysis, which is basically looking at external influences. Where's the sun coming? Where is it passing over? How does that affect a site? What's the aspect of the land on the site? Crazy. It seems like such common sense. Where the winds are coming, if you have flood potential, where's that coming? All these external influences. Most people don't design for it. I see cropland put out where there's no relevance to where the sun is. Just like at my farm, when we first bought our farm, it was structured with irrigation where you had north-facing irrigation on the same irrigation with west-facing. West is always hotter. You have the more intense sun. North is always needs less water. And they started to get root rot in all the north because they had to water to the west trees. Cost thousands of dollars because nobody thought of it when they were designing it. Super practical. We call that sector analysis. We do a slope analysis. How's water flowing? How is air moving? Hot air rising, cold air falling. I'm actually able to grow multiple crops, tropical, subtropical plants in the thermal zones higher up on the hill, and cold crops that need cold, like apples and persimmons at the bottom, and citrus in the middle. Because we take advantage of the slope analysis in our land. And so now we have more biodiversity because there's actually microclimates in the slope. And then we do what's called feedback integration, which is basically a system is never done being designed. Nature always evolves. Our designs have to evolve. And that's a big lesson we're learning from climate change, is that we have to continue to accept feedback and redesign our system. Nothing in the earth is ever not in motion. So even a stone, the molecules are in motion just very, very slowly. And so how do we design for that motion? And so feedback integration is a part of it. And that's just like, you just got like a 2-week course, basically condensed into about 10 minutes. So that I wanted to share because I'm talking about resilience design, but it's actually a toolkit. That's what it is. It's not this idea of resilience. It's actually how you actually design in a landscape and bring it together in a design process. And we're using a lot of integrating strategies that are out there: agroforestry, holistic management, grazing, alley cropping, biointensive agriculture, no tillage. Have you ever heard of FMNR? Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration? No. If you get one thing you look up after this, is I would look up FMNR. It's really, really interesting. Tony Renato in World Vision. In Niger, in Africa, they are the only country that has net afforestation because of FMNR. And it's basically, they found that the forest was still on the ground, but it had been grazed in living memory, and nobody remembered that the bushes on the ground were actually once trees. And so they were expressing themselves as shrubs. And when he realized this, he's like, oh my God, if we prune them back, the tree will come back. And it's amazing. In one growing season, they have forest. And so now in one growing season, the farmers immediately raise 10 to 15% their income level just by integrating this technique. So it's really interesting. FMNR, I would look it up for sure. I'm going to just kind of wrap. Let me show one other example of application of this. This is a design that I did. It was a smallholder farm that was feeding an orphanage outside of Nairobi in a really crazy little area called Athi River. And it's a 2-hectare site. Really, this was a design process we went through. Now, if you look at the soils, this was an old dump site. And see the compaction, I mean, really poor soils, there was like no organic matter in it, very compacted, and Bermuda grass growing everywhere. It's like most farmers would say, oh, you can't grow anything here. And so we started by always building the hydrology, because we know life will follow water. So how do we harvest water on-site, and could we even bring water that was flowing away off-site, on-site? So looking at water harvesting, creating microclimates, and then starting to plant perennials within that. Slowly, we started to get some plants going out there with some food growing, and then within 3 years, our whole agroforestry system popped out of that soil because we built those fast carbon pathways. And so we actually planted more what we call leguminous plants that bring in nitrogen, bring in nutrients into the system than we did fruit plants. And everybody thought we were crazy. But what we were doing was building the conditions for the success of the farm. So within 3 years, and then also using biogas, so we did basically taking the kids' poo and the manure from the cows, and we made the methane for all their cooking. But then the effluent we could then compost out again and aerate it and get it back out as nutrient. And so we started to see incredible production. We got a grant for a greenhouse.
Single poly?
Yeah. And so we went from 3 years from this system to this system.
Wow.
And yeah, really, really, really great. It was, I'd love to show those pictures. So let me just wrap here with, I wasn't going to show this, but I will anyway. This is happening here. I'm working on a consultancy for Los Angeles County. The entire biosolids facility in Tulare Lake up near Kettleman City in the Central Valley. They have 14,000 acres and they're producing over 500,000 tons a year of biosolid compost. And they called me and said, we are wanting to change our story. We want to sequester carbon, and we want to have regenerative agriculture be the product of this compost. We want to upcycle the compost. Most big mega cities are going to the compost level and saying, check, we're done. And then they give it to extractive agriculture practices that cause more damage in the landscape. And they said, we want to be one of the first cities to change this, and we want to offset our carbon. Can you help us? So it's pretty exciting what's happening on that. But it's happening here too. That's the thing I wanted to bring in here. And then we're, currently our TOPS team, and this is the 3 trainers, this guy named Tom Cole, Brad Lancaster, and myself. Brad wrote all the rainwater harvesting for dryland books. They're very famous books out there in Arabic, and they're in English and starting to be written in other languages as well. And we're doing this development of the training, we're doing the toolkit development, but what we're really working towards is this next layer. We just got a grant to develop our monitoring and measuring tools, our evaluation tools, and looking at what are the indicators of resilience. So basically, we're really looking at the indicators of the connectivity between things. Just like we were saying, what are those things and what can be measured? We want to develop a network of people doing resilience beyond USAID, but also would have access to USAID funds. Demonstration sites with different site characteristics. We're in the works right now. Some of the first ones are going to be developed in northern Uganda to actually have USAID-held demonstration sites of this type of design. And then advanced training programs, including a full permaculture design course, field mentoring, and certification. And we're doing this course down at our site, our dryland site, which is a permaculture design course, a resilience design course for people working in international development. So if any of you are interested, I'll put up a thing. I'll put up a slide with that course up there. So we talk about blue economy, and I don't have a lot of, I just kind of want to wrap so there's time for questions, but basically when I start to think of the blue economy, I start to think of we need to work from the big patterns to the details, not the other way around. I think you were saying that when you were talking about what are the bigger patterns that are influencing things rather than the details. Oftentimes if you focus on those, you're working with symptoms. And so thinking of creating a blue economy is meaning, it's about pattern recognition skills, I think. And I think it's about then working with pattern recognition to redesign our landscapes, because for us to have healthy oceans, we need to really start to work at the top of watersheds. We know that, we know that, and we can do it. We want to work with water using nature's examples. Well, how does nature work with water? What are the natural patterns? And then linking strategies for creating stable hydrology, soil building, and carbon sequestration. How many of you have heard of biomimicry? A couple people? Well, everybody, almost. So biomimicry is looking at systems. I want to end on this slide. This is an ant called Solenopsis invictus. It's an ant that is in the Amazon basin, and every year when the Amazon is about to flood into its floodplains, here's these ants that are out there. There's triggers in the environment that tell them great change is happening, the flood is about to happen. And in 90 seconds they've actually seen and they've documented how these ants will come together, and in 90 seconds over 1 million of them will come together and they'll lock their mandibles. And then they each individually exert a bubble of oxygen. And they create this flotilla that they're able to ride for almost 3 weeks, the waters, and then reestablish themselves when the waters recede. And I don't know if you're feeling it, but I think there's a lot to learn from this. Because the indicators are there right now. And we can't do it alone. One ant won't survive this. We all need to come together, and we need to, I don't know if we want to exude a bubble of oxygen, but you know what I mean. Like, we all need to come together with our gifts and our multitude and diverse ways of approaching the very complex systems that are out there and complex issues that are out there. And what I believe is that we start with very simple solutions, but we do it very uniquely and very individually. And so I think for me that's what this actually means. So thank you today, and I really appreciate just having an opportunity. I went a little over, but I appreciate it, so thank you. My website, my main website is permaculturedesign.us, but the International Development course is at the quellsprings.org website, and our other family farms at Casitas Valley. So every May we do an international development permaculture course, and we have people all over the world come in for it. And we have, I mean, it's amazing what's happening now. We're getting like companies like Lush Cosmetics, who, I don't know if any of you know Lush Cosmetics. I do a lot of design work for them. They are literally changing the way companies are looking at supply chain and saying, is it regenerative? Can they supply what they need from regenerative sources? And they can't, because there's not enough people doing it at that scale. So instead of just saying, oh, that can't be done, they said, well, how could we use our dollars to drive the change? So now they partner with their farmers to actually move towards regenerative design. So they hire people like me to come in and work with the farmers to redesign their sites. They work, and that's with the Maasai ladies in Kenya, in northern Kenya, or with jojoba farmers in the Sonoran Desert, and now possibly doing some work with almond growers in the Central Valley. So it's really exciting, all the people that come to these courses, and yeah, just hope anybody's interested. We'd love to have you. Yay.
So I'm sure we'll have a few questions.
Yeah, any questions or thoughts or comments or, yeah.
First of all, I would like to thank you for this talk, because I've been looking for something like this. I didn't know it was this, but I think this is it. I know that we have to do agriculture in a different way than what we're doing right now. And I come from a family where we have this big plot of land in the countryside, but we also have most of my family live in the city. but I always wanted to do something different on the farm we had in the countryside, and I didn't know what to do. And I was really interested in, I still am interested in aquaponics.
Yeah.
So I've been looking into this, how to do a different kind of farming. So this permaculture and the way you're going about it, I really want to know more about this.
Great.
So it's just wonderful hearing from you and your vision and how you see things going from here. And I'll also want to know if, I mean, for someone who doesn't have any background in agriculture and soil, etc., what do you think we need in addition to just to discuss your offering?
Well, I think it depends on your, and well, thank you for your question, your comment, thank you. I think that a lot of people don't have agricultural skills but are interested. There's a whole movement of young people coming from the city back out to rebuild a different type of agriculture. It's interesting, the average age of, up to a few years ago of a farmer in America was over 60, which tells you that the system's in decline if you have no new people interested in taking it on. And young people, young people, I'm feeling, are in a place where they're more heart-centered. And they're saying, you know what, there's something about this not life-giving. I don't want to put my energy into it. And it makes sense. It's like, it's actually, I think, a socio-cultural response to something that's not life-giving and you feel it in your body. And it's like, I want to change that. So, depends if you're like, one of the ways that you may be really interested in or being able to put your gifts into it might be at a policy level. It might be on working with other farmers with it. But what I find is you start in the garden. So do you grow a garden at your own house? That's a great way to learn. Then the other is to understand design and pattern recognition skills. So develop your pattern recognition skills. That, I think, is the most important tool of our day. The top entrepreneurs in the world, they have really good pattern recognition skills. They see patterns before they converge, and then they meet it with the business. Well, let's do the same thing with the reparation work that needs to happen. Let's see where the patterns are going. So develop those skills, I think, are really important. If you really want to start to get into the mechanics of it, what I say is mentor with farmers that are building soil. It doesn't matter what their background is. If their soil is getting richer every single year, that's who I would go and study with. And I'm a firm believer in mentoring. And more there's like UC Berkeley's developing a really great program in agroforestry and holistic grazing, and there's different things like you can go and they're doing some great backup work to a lot of us out in the field. And then they're also developing a lot of their work as well. So there's different ways you can go with it, but I say always start in the garden. I really believe a lot of the world's problems could be solved in the garden. I really believe that. I remember being in Liberia. I brought the first permaculture course into Liberia right after the war ended in 2005. And it was this crazy dynamic there. And one of the things that they did at the end of that war is they elected the first woman president in the history of Africa, not just in Liberia, which was Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who's one of my incredible heroes. And I was working for the vice president. It was really interesting. At that point, there wasn't the palace, the presidential palace or the civic buildings. It's like these little blown out buildings. You would go and sit with the vice president of the country. And I was reporting to him directly every trip. And one time I was driving in and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was talking, and she's like, on the radio, UN military radio, West Africa, and she was talking, she's like, Liberians, there's one thing we can do to stop from going back into warfare. And I'm like, driving along, I'm like, huh. She's like, there's one thing we can do from our kids having malnutrition. And I'm like, pull over, I'm like listening, I'm like, well, what is it, And she's like, there's one thing we can do to keep from having to sell ourselves to the West. There's one thing. And she just kept going, and I'm like, come on, Ellen, what is it, And she says, I want every Liberian to grow a garden. Every Liberian needs to grow a garden, and it will change our future in such positive ways. And I thought about that. I'm like, her saying that doesn't raise her GDP. You know what I mean? The country's GDP doesn't go up because people are gardening at home. It actually is an opposite effect. But it was a grandmother president who was saying, this is life-giving, this is what our people need. And I really believe that. And again, I'm a storyteller, so I don't answer things very quickly, so careful what you ask. But I love that story, it just reminds me. And for me, growing a garden is also a part of being in touch with something that sustains me directly. Really important. What else? What else? Other questions? Yeah.
So I come from an ag and soil background.
Yeah.
And my questions are, so you mentioned no-till ag.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what the impact on productivity and yield is with no-till. And also, you mentioned about how a third of the planet are still smallholder farmers. With the increase of urbanization and economic standing,
Yeah.
more people are leaving the farm and
Yeah,
going to the
yeah.
city. And so, at a certain point, where does technology have to take over for the lack of man?
Well,
man?
great questions. I think one is just to steer you towards the conservation ag research, which is all about no tillage. There's a lot of really good valid research in there. I only use no tillage. However, in a really badly damaged landscape, very compacted, crusted landscapes, I'll usually do a disturbance in the very beginning of my farm design, but then never again after that. So I use, like here in America and in Kenya, I have a keyline plow, which is a non-inversion plow that flocculates the soil. And what we do is we create the pathways for the roots to take over for the exchanges of gases and nutrients and water. But if we hadn't made the disturbance in the beginning, it wouldn't happen. But then we never do it again. What we do is we top dress our farm. So we're actually creating a soil biota that digests the organic matter and actually extends the healthy soil into the full rhizosphere. So in through the whole root zone. And so the data is really clearly out there. And so in relation to production, what we're finding is we can actually produce more food per square meter by using multiple strategies than we can with a monocrop. That's the thing the data is very skewed about, is that you get a monocrop saying we can get this much more corn, but what we're saying is we can get this much more nutrition per square meter. Now, statistically, if you look at the conventional plow farming agriculture that's using chemical inputs, the average energy in is 10 calories per 1 calorie of food out. And that's really well documented. So for every calorie of food you're getting, it's taking 10 calories of energy to produce it.
Is that kilocalories or just?
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing to look at. And then you look at what, there's a guy named Steve Moore, Professor Steve Moore at Elon University, and they're doing a lot of very good research on energy in, energy out, and he's got a lot of peer-reviewed articles and things out there as well, and they're getting, with their bioproductive farms, they're getting, for every calorie in, they're getting 34 calories of energy out. But they're again, no tillage systems, they're biodiverse, you're stacking in place and time, so we're growing three-dimensionally. We're also, because we're paying attention to the rhizosphere, we can actually biointensively stack plants closer than if you had just tilled every single time and your soil biology doesn't have a chance to develop. So we're actually able to stack them in closer, the plants together, and have more variety. So when I grow maize, I also grow interstitially. Well, you've heard of Three Sisters? Have you ever heard of that? The corn, beans, and squash? Well, traditionally there was also an ugly brother. Everybody forgets about the ugly brother, which was a little dead fish. So they always put, all the Apache, all the people in Central America, they always put dead fish in the bottom of it. And then they had the corn, the beans, the squash, but then you also had sunflower. So I always grow sunflower interstitially, and potato. Potato is another one. And then I also have other pollinator plants that are growing within, and other edge plants that I do as well that draw in a diversity of pollinators. So you start to see that you can, rather than just look at the maize, now, yeah, the maize production per meter will be lower in that system, but you'll have way more calories of output in that same system. So it's again how the question's asked. And then the second question was what? I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
The impact of urbanization and what point
yes.
should technology such as GM technology take over? I mean, I'm a proponent of GM technology.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certainly aspects of it that are broken, like the patent system and the application in grain crops in the U.S., but there is potential for it to promote yield increase, promote nutritional health. And so at what point should technology overtake the lack of capable work in the field?
Great question.
We couldn't get the American public to go harvest Iowa.
So you have to look at it from a bigger pattern set, I believe. I think you have to look at one, that the systems that are soil degrading, that take more energy than they produce, can't continue into the future. And so we're finding that the technological solutions still are higher energy sinks. They take more energy than they produce. So that is just out there, and I share, please go do your research. I also feel that the idea of everything being export agriculture and dependence on very minimal crops is the end of humanity. I think as we start to see the ability of us to just produce singular carbohydrate for all of humanity, we're going to start to see other issues that start to happen, both from a nutritional standpoint and also from an ecological standpoint, because that biodiversity is lost, and we're starting to, move towards that Armageddon that the Tutu Hill are talking about, I believe. I think the issue has to do with why is it that farmers are going into the cities.
Because the economics don't exist.
And so looking at that and saying, how do we revalue wealth? I mean, we work on a wealth-based system called a GDP-based system. So if we have more cancer in our country, our GDP goes up. If we have warfare, our GDP goes up.
More coal mine
The more warfare. So you start to look at, is that our benchmark of wealth? I think that's a bigger issue. That if we're starting to put everything we're doing in one form of capital, it's a valid form of capital. Economics is a valid form, but if that's our only benchmark, and I actually map out 8 forms of natural capital. And does a community have that? Where are they looking for that? I mean, there's so many other forms of capital that are needed. For me, I don't have a 401k. I just put it right into more trees. I just put it right into more trees. I can make money from it now, but always I'll have something that is barterable and tradable. And so I don't know. I think it's a really good question, and I think it really begs to say, what's the bigger pattern? What are the influences that are causing that? And is that something we want to keep in that pattern set, that people are migrating? I mean, we've came to like you said, the first time in human history, a few years ago, we have more people in cities than in the country. Never before happened. And we have the diminishing, basically, food systems of the smallholder farmer. What you get from the academic and kind of industry-driven set is that, oh, we can't feed the world unless we do that. And I just totally disagree. And the science, to me, when I look at the peer-reviewed science, doesn't agree with that either. And so I think it's one of those things that we have to, I think, again, it's bigger discussions than what we can get into here. But I really appreciate the question coming out, because that's a question every class I go to brings up, every question, every time. And so it's important that we keep the dialogue open. So thank you. Maybe one last question. We're just 11:26. Yeah.
So I had a couple things actually. Thank you.
Yeah.
For this is really tremendous. I mean, it's almost like we're going back to the older ways that we used to do things, really, that were more in harmony with nature. So that's fantastic. I do wonder about, I also think that because of that, some of the developing areas are more resilient because they're used to dealing with variation, whereas our monocrop system is not. And so the climate change is more, probably in some ways is a bigger threat to monocrop than it is to diversified crop systems. I also wonder about, you know, even with organic now, we've gone monocrop.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like how we've made a little bit of change, but that isn't gonna work with the organic piece. I also wonder about the hydroponics, which are now becoming sort of fashionable. Is there more of a prosthetic where because the soil is bad, because the hydration system is bad, that's why we're doing it.
I think that's where you start to see technology, for me, comes into a really, I think, a bridging time where technology is really important, but I don't think it's actually genetics. I think it's actually biointensive, using a multitude of systems. I'm doing work with the Chumash tribe, which is down in the central part of California, below here, this is central too, but down Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, down to Malibu. And the northern Chumash are developing biointensive vertical farming. And what we're doing, it's a monocrop. What they're doing is a monocrop. That's how they're testing it as an economic model. Strawberries. But they're growing 10 foot tall, and they're doing it in a soil biota active medium. So it's not aquaponics, but it's actually done on volcanic soils. And they are getting, it is an incredible amount of food that they're producing, and so now we're starting to test other nutritional foods other than strawberry. But strawberries being the economic driver that allows then their community who have huge diabetes difficulties right now, that they're looking for other nutritional ways of doing this and to provide work without having to build a casino. That's what they're trying to do. The northern Chumash are saying, we don't want to build a casino, because we have to put our land in trust with the U.S. government. We don't want to do that. Whenever you build a casino, you have to do that. So they're trying to do this, but I'm seeing this amazing place where technology is, and again, appropriate technology, I am all about it. Like I am, I have a tractor, I have a keyline plow, I use lasers, I've got all these things that save so much energy in redesigning the landscape. I can go and I do a lot of work with monocrop big farms that are like, if we weren't making subsidies, which is the course of all the monocrop farmers in Ohio, all of them, if you were to put them and make them put their agriculture practice into free market, it would immediately stop, because they're making it on subsidy. So that tells you another thing, that even it's not being subjected to a normal economic system.
It's not the
And so part of it is like, that's what I would say. I would say let's subject our agriculture to free market.
Then you're subjecting the consumer to the free market, which they won't like at all.
Yeah, and I think that's the part where we have to really look at the energy in, energy out, and what is the true cost of things, because you have all these externalized costs in the Mississippi River Basin. You have the billions of dollars being from the flooding that's going on that has to do with poor agriculture practices upstream, and so when you have externalized costs that aren't incorporated into it, you're not seeing the true cost and the true benefit, or the true lack of benefit. So it's really great questions. I wish we had more time, but it is 11:30, and I just thank you all for a great conversation. So thank you.